So Steve is one of our top evangelical New Testament scholars and a remarkable achievement. He's writing a massive new word commentary on Acts of the Apostles. And recently, at the end of last year, Volume 1 was published. And so what we are here to do tonight is to celebrate with Steve, to congratulate him on this accomplishment, but just to remind him that a third is not really good enough. That there's the other two-thirds that we are waiting for as well. But it struck me in thinking about this event that to paint with very broad brushstrokes, Catholics are well known for living in the Gospels. Now, KLC would like to change that. We want to spend a lot of time in the Gospels. Protestants are incredibly well known for living in the epistles. But who is well known for living in Acts of the Apostles? Maybe the Charismatics and the Pentecostals and others, I don't know. But Steve was just reminding us as we were in the waiting room. I would love to say we have a green room, but you know what I mean. We were in the Zoom waiting room, that between Luke and Acts, that makes up 25% of the New Testament, which is remarkable. And a thing that struck me years ago in my work is that Acts of the Apostles is the linchpin of the New Testament that holds the Gospels and the epistles together. So the Gospels, in terms of Jesus' ministry, would not make sense without Acts, which is about the continuation of Jesus' ministry. And the epistles would make no sense whatsoever if you weren't able to read about the way in which the gospel spread from Jerusalem to Judea to the whole of the Roman Empire in Acts of the Apostles, with churches being set up to whom letters were written. So one thing we want to do tonight is to affirm the central importance of Acts of the Apostles and to thank Steve for the phenomenal work that he is doing. So the way this is going to operate tonight, Steve is going to introduce the commentary and talk a bit about what it's been like working away on Acts. And then we have two wonderful respondents, Matthew and Marion, and they will each respond for about 10 minutes, and then we will move to Q&A. Okay? So can I ask you, please, if you haven't already, to mute your microphones, and then Steve, we'll hand over to you.
Just to introduce myself briefly, I work for Trinity College in Bristol, which is an Anglican theological college, and I'm primarily working at this stage of my life supervising our doctoral students, one or two of whom are here with us. So let me talk about two things: why study Acts, and then what it's been like working on Acts for the commentary. The first small commentary I ever bought as a sixth former, so I was about 17, was Ralph P. Martin's little commentary on Acts, which was published by the Scripture Union. And so years later, it was really interesting when Ralph himself, then the Word Biblical Commentary editor, asked if I'd be interested in writing on Acts for the series. I'd first become academically interested in Acts through an essay which Professor Charlie Mole sent me during my first term at Theological College on the theological distinctives of Luke. And in working on that, I came across the debate about how accurate the portrait of Paul in Acts is when you compare it to the portrait of Paul in the letters. And that led to an undergrad dissertation and ultimately to my doctoral thesis, which focused on Paul's speech at Miletus to the Ephesian elders in Acts 20. So when Ralph Martin approached me about writing this commentary, I was interested. I'd only a year earlier finished my PhD and was working on publishing it. Sadly, Ralph didn't live to see the first volume of the commentary. I hope he'd have been pleased with it. So why should everyone be interested in Acts? Well, Craig's begun to help us think about this. First of all, because Acts is a key bridge between the Gospels and the New Testament, the rest of the New Testament, to the extent that C.K. Barrett suggests that what you got in Luke and Acts is the New Testament in miniature. You've got Gospel and early church. Interestingly, the New Testament that Tyndale House produced recently uses the book order of many of the early Greek manuscripts, which puts the four Gospels up front, then Acts, then the Catholic epistles, and then the Pauline epistles and Hebrews and the book of Revelation, which is not the order we're used to. Our more usual order places Acts as the hinge from the Gospels to Paul. Acts shows us how the story develops after Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension, and prepares us then to read letters about the life of the early Christian communities. Secondly, Acts shows us that Jesus didn't stop acting when he ascended to heaven. Notice particularly Acts 1:1, where the author describes Luke's gospel as the things which Jesus began to do and teach. Acts, in other words, is what Jesus continues to do and teach. Jesus is still at work in the book of Acts. Now, you can see that in Jesus being the one who pours out the Spirit at Pentecost. That's what Peter says in 2:33. In healing Aeneas, do you remember Peter says to him, Aeneas, Jesus the Messiah heals you in 9:43. And of course, in Jesus himself appearing to Saul of Tarsus on the Damascus Road in chapter 9, and then orchestrating Saul's meeting with Ananias by appearing to Ananias in a vision. Now, that feature of Jesus' engagement with the early Christians invites Christians today, I think, to look for ways in which Jesus is now at work, rather than thinking of him just as a figure of the past. Thirdly, Acts shows us a focus on mission. Jesus' words in chapter 1, verse 8 are key here, where Jesus promises that when the Spirit comes, he'll enable the disciples to be Jesus' witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the end of the earth. The end of the earth, and it is end. The Greek is singular, in spite of many translations translating it as plural. The end of the earth echoes Isaiah 49:6 and other passages to give the sense everywhere. The disciples are going out in the power of the Spirit to announce that Jesus is Lord. They aren't going to win territory as an army might, but they're going to announce the news of Jesus' reign. Fourthly, Acts places our attention on God rather than people. Acts is not a story of brilliant human strategy leading to successful church growth. It's of a God-directed project which sometimes moves in surprising directions, such as to hated Samaritans, to an Ethiopian eunuch in a road in the middle of, the middle of Gaza, or the Roman centurion Cornelius's household. It even includes the surprising event of God changing the direction of Paul's team in Acts 16 to cross over the Aegean Sea from what we now think of as Turkey into Macedonia in the north of Greece. So I hope one of the things you'll find in my commentary is a strong focus on divine action. So let me talk about writing the commentary. A key feature of working on the commentary for me has been a great sense of privilege. When I sit down to work on it, I find myself feeling honoured to engage in depth with this part of Scripture in order to help others understand it and engage better with it themselves in colleges, universities, churches, and other Christian groups. Now, the format of the Word Biblical Commentary has been an interesting partner in writing. Discussion of each passage falls into 6 parts, and I've thought of different audiences for each of these parts. First of all comes a little bibliography of key works, articles, monographs, essays in edited volumes, and the like. The other commentaries don't come here. They go in a general bibliography at the start of the book. And I'm writing this section for postgraduate students and for other scholars who want to identify key works to consult. Secondly, there's a fresh translation of the text, which the guidance from my editors says is to reflect the end result of the exegetical work on the portion. Now, that meant sometimes that I did an initial translation and then changed some details as I did fuller work on the passage. Immediately after the translation come the notes, which are keyed to the translation, and they're primarily there to explain tricky bits of the Greek, to discuss textual variants among the manuscripts and versions. And I wrote both the translation and the notes with my second year Greek classes in mind, thinking, what would I need to explain for somebody who's done an introductory course which has taught them the basics of Greek grammar? Fourthly, there's a section called Form Structure Setting. Now, I think this heading owes a lot to the origins of this series in the 1970s, when form and redaction criticism was still the dominant methods in New Testament studies. So I think that heading comes from that period. What I've written about here is about the delimitation of the passage, explaining why I've divided the text the way I have and why I think the section begins and ends where it does. I've discussed the form as relevant, and occasionally you get sections which include subsections which are a particular form. Think of the prayer in Acts 4:23 to 31. I've then talked about sources and historicity. The two are usually closely connected. And in the case of historicity, sometimes what I can say on this is limited by worldview considerations. Some scholars will read a passage and their understanding of it will be shaped by their belief or their non-belief in a supernatural God who intervenes in humans' lives. To be clear, I do believe there's a supernatural God who intervenes in this world. There then follows discussion of the passage's structure. How is it organized? Are there any parallel passages elsewhere which could help us with this? And setting is then about the location of the passage. Where does this fit in the immediate context of Acts, the passages just before and after? Where does it fit in the major sections of Acts? And has it got a role in the whole book? Much of that section of the commentary is written for fellow students and scholars, although I hope the discussions of the delimitation and the setting will also be useful to those who preach on Acts. Fifthly comes the heart of each section, which is the detailed comment, sentence by sentence, through the passage. In accordance with the editor's guidance, I always translate Greek here to aid those whose Greek is either rusty or absent. Each paragraph begins with a phrase from the text, and there then follows detailed explanation of the meaning of words, the content of the text in the light of its literary and social and cultural contexts, in interaction with scholarship, of course. Interaction with scholarship doesn't mean that this is the kind of commentary which is a telephone directory of scholarly opinions. I am aiming, adapting my friend Dick Francis' words, to write a commentary on Acts, not a commentary on the commentaries on Acts. The introduction of footnotes in recent volumes in the series, I think, is a big plus. In earlier volumes in the series, the references were all in the middle of the text, which made the text quite cluttered at times. And I think the footnotes are helpful in enabling readers to read more clearly. Now, I've written the comment with my second and third year Greek classes in mind, although I'm hoping pastors and preachers will consult it after reading the final section, which is called Explanation. That section aims to draw all the threads of the discussion together to offer an overall interpretation of the passage. So it's much briefer than the comment, because it's working with the conclusions drawn in the comment to allow readers that having had their noses right up to the picture and looked at the brush strokes and the colours, to step back and see the whole picture of that passage. I'm writing that section with my wife in mind. My wife Ali is a Church of England minister, and she preaches regularly. So it's her and people like her that I've written that section for. And that's why I'd recommend that although those 6 sections go in that order, that you read the explanation section first on a particular passage, because that will show you the big picture of what's going on. And then you can go rummaging around in the detail to see why I think what I think. So in the explanation, you'll find my summary of the passage's key points and emphases in the micro content of the immediately surrounding passages and in the macro content of the major sections of Acts and the whole book.